The last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft amber glow over Cedar Springs Park. Evelyn Carter walked at a steady pace along the brick path, the leash of her Belgian Malinois Max firmly in hand. At 65, Evelyn still carried herself with the strength of someone who had seen battle. A former U.S. Army soldier, she had spent years navigating the harsh realities of war in Iraq. Now, retired and settled in the quiet town of Cedar Springs, she had chosen a life of peace, or at least as much peace as the world would allow. Max was a warrior in his own right. Once a military working dog, he had been deployed on dangerous missions alongside his fellow soldiers. But those days were behind him. Now he was retired, entrusted to Evelyn's care. And though he was no longer on the battlefield, his instincts had never dulled, something Evelyn understood all too well. Their evening walks in the park had become routine, a way for Evelyn to unwind and for Max to stretch his legs. But tonight, something was off. Max suddenly halted, his ears standing erect. His sharp eyes scanned the park, his breathing slow but tense. Evelyn felt it too, a faint, unsettling ripple in the air. Her instincts, honed by years of military service, whispered that something wasn't right. Across the park, a small group of young men loitered near an old bench. Laughter, laced with something mocking, cut through the quiet. One of them, a tall figure in a leather jacket, glanced at Evelyn, his stare carrying an edge of irritation. A cold breeze drifted through the park, sending a shiver down her spine. Evelyn's grip on Max's leash tightened slightly. Tonight's walk might not be as peaceful as usual. Evelyn kept walking, her pace steady, trying to brush off the unease creeping up her spine. But Max wasn't so easily convinced. The fur on his back bristled, his ears perked as he tracked every movement around them. Evelyn had seen this reaction before. Max was on high alert. As they turned onto a narrow path deeper inside the park, she spotted the reason why. 4 men lingered around an abandoned bench, a place most people avoided. Clad in leather jackets, their arms and necks were inked with crude, menacing tattoos. Evelyn recognized them instantly. These weren't strangers to Cedar Springs. They were troublemakers, members of a gang that had been stirring up chaos for years. And their leader, Duke Slater, was someone to watch out for. Duke was in his 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his buzzed hair making the jagged scar across his cheek stand out even more, a remnant of past brawls. He had done time for assault, but strutted back into town as if he owned the place. Worse than that, Duke had a very particular grudge. He despised people who didn't look like him. Evelyn quickened her pace, hoping to pass unnoticed. Too late. Duke's gaze locked onto her. His lips curled into a smirk as he nudged the guy next to him before stepping forward to block her path. Well, look who we have here." His voice was slow, laced with mockery. The other 3 chuckled, their eyes shifting from Evelyn to Max. "What the hell is this? A retired soldier walking around with a war dog?" One of them scoffed. Evelyn didn't react. She'd seen men like this before, bullies who thrived on intimidation. But Max wasn't one to ignore threats. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his throat, low and steady, a warning. Duke raised an eyebrow and glanced down at the dog, still grinning. "Easy there, old boy." He nudged the dirt with his boot, taunting. Max responded instantly, lunging forward just enough to bare his teeth, his muscles coiled like a spring. Evelyn tightened her grip on the leash, keeping him controlled. Duke's smirk faded slightly. "Oh, I remember you now," he muttered, his tone shifting to something colder. "Army vet, right? Used to be tough back in the day. What happened? Now you're just wandering around town with a damn dog?" Evelyn exhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just out for a walk. I don't want any trouble." Duke stepped in closer. "No trouble, huh? Funny thing about trouble, it tends to find people like you." Behind him, one of his goons whistled. "Hey, Duke, I think the old lady needs a reminder of who runs this place." Another one tapped the gun at his waist, a silent but obvious threat. Evelyn's grip on the leash tightened. Max's growl deepened, his amber eyes locked onto Duke with unwavering focus. Every nerve in Evelyn's body told her this was about to turn ugly. But there was one thing these idiots didn't know. They had no idea who they were messing with. Duke crossed his arms over his chest, his cold gaze sweeping over Evelyn from head to toe. "This old lady used to be in the military? Must have been real tough back in the day," he drawled, his tone dripping with mockery. One of his men smirked. Now she's just a crippled old hag dragging around a lame dog. The gang burst into laughter. Evelyn didn't react. She had heard these kinds of words her entire life. As a black woman in the military, she had learned not to let the opinions of others shake her resolve. But Max was different. The dog's growl deepened, his sharp amber eyes locked onto the men in front of him. His back arched slightly, muscles coiled, ready to strike at any moment. One of the gang members, a scruffy-looking guy with a snake tattoo wrapped around his neck, sneered. "That mutt looks mean, but I bet it's just a useless old dog." Then he did something incredibly stupid. He swung his foot at Max. But Max wasn't an ordinary dog. In a flash, he dodged to the side, lightning fast, before letting out a ferocious snarl. His sharp fangs bared, his eyes burned with fury, ready to tear apart the fool who dared to challenge him. The thug froze, stumbling back a step. "Shit, that thing is fast," he muttered, his previous arrogance fading. Evelyn tightened Max's leash, her voice dropping into a low warning. "You boys don't want to push your luck." Duke raised an eyebrow, then threw his head back in laughter. "Listen here, old lady. You think you're still some kind of warrior? You're nothing but a washed-up vet, living off government checks, walking around with a broken-down dog. Out here, we make the rules." Evelyn didn't say a word. She just stared at Duke, unwavering. That unsettled him. "The hell are you looking at?" he snapped, then suddenly shoved Evelyn. The push wasn't hard enough to hurt a veteran like her, but it threw her off balance, sending her to the dusty ground. And in that exact moment, Max snapped. The dog lunged forward like a bullet, letting out a powerful, bone-chilling snarl as he leaped straight at Duke. A deep, menacing growl echoed through the park. Duke barely had time to widen his eyes before Max was on him. The real fight had just begun. Duke stepped forward, his eyes filled with challenge. "Old lady, why don't you just be smart and walk away?" he sneered. Max immediately let out a low growl, his fur bristling. One of the gang members smirked and lifted his foot, aiming to kick Max. But before his boot could make contact, Max was already moving, sidestepping with precision, his sharp eyes locked onto the threat. Evelyn folded her arms, her voice calm but firm. "Not a good idea, kid." The man hesitated, his confidence wavering. But Duke didn't care. He snatched a wooden stick from one of his men and took another step forward. Max barked sharply, ready to act. Evelyn remained steady, her gaze locked onto Duke without a hint of fear. She had faced far greater dangers before. This group was nothing compared to what she'd seen. "You think that dog will save you?" Duke scoffed, gripping the stick tighter. A brief silence hung in the air. Then Evelyn moved. With expert precision, she grabbed Duke's wrist before he could swing the stick. A swift, practiced turn of her body, using his own momentum, sent the weapon flying from his grasp. Crack! In an instant, Duke found his arm locked in a tight hold. Let go!" he shouted, struggling but unable to break free. His crew stood frozen. They couldn't believe that a 65-year-old woman had just taken down their leader so effortlessly. One of them stammered, "Duke, maybe we should just go." Duke clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with anger, and something else, hesitation. Finally, he yanked his arm free and took a few steps back. The gang exchanged uncertain glances before deciding to retreat. Evelyn watched them go, making no move to chase after them. Instead, she knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears as she spoke in a steady, knowing voice. "This isn't over, kid." Max let out a low growl, his eyes still fixed in the direction the gang had disappeared. Evelyn knew. This was only the beginning. Evelyn slowly stepped out of the park, Max staying alert by her side. The thugs had left, but she knew this wasn't over. She decided to head to the police station to report the incident. The Cedar Springs Police Department was small, with only a few officers on duty. Behind his desk, Police Chief Ryan Mitchell, a tall black man, a former FBI agent who had returned home to take up the badge, was flipping through a case file. The moment he saw Evelyn walk in, he looked up immediately. "Evelyn? What's going on?" She got straight to the point. "I just had an interesting encounter with Duke Slater and his boys at the park." Ryan set the file down, his brow furrowing. "Duke, tell me everything." Evelyn recounted the entire event, leaving nothing out. When she reached the part about Duke's threats and the attack, Ryan exhaled sharply, his expression turning cold. "I've been trying to put that bastard behind bars for years." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Duke's slippery. He's got top-tier lawyers, and he knows how to intimidate witnesses into staying silent. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. What about this time? I'm willing to testify. Ryan tapped his fingers on the desk. It's not that simple. We need hard evidence, especially since they didn't leave any serious injuries on you. Evelyn narrowed her eyes, her voice steady. I don't need anyone to protect me, but if they think I'm just going to sit back and take this, they're dead wrong. Ryan studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. I hear you, Evelyn. Just be careful. Duke isn't some two-bit thug. He's got deep ties in this town. Suddenly, Max barked sharply, his gaze locked on the window. Evelyn turned to look. Across the street, a motorcycle sat idling in silence. The moment her eyes met it, the engine roared, and the rider sped off. Ryan stood, stepping closer to the window, his face grim. They're watching you. Evelyn clenched her fists. Good. Let's see who's hunting who. The night sky over Cedar Springs was empty. Not a single star in sight. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, whispering eerie sounds into the darkness. Evelyn sat on the old rocking chair on her porch, a steaming cup of tea in hand. Max lay at her feet, ears perked, golden eyes scanning their surroundings with sharp vigilance. She took a sip of her tea, but that uneasy feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. A veteran like Evelyn had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her. Someone was watching. Max let out a low growl, his gaze locked onto the wooden fence beyond the yard. Evelyn set her cup down and tightened her grip around the metal cane resting beside her. Then, a sound echoed from the backyard. Evelyn narrowed her eyes and rose to her feet. She had just stepped off the porch when a deep, gravelly voice emerged from the shadows. Been a while, Mrs. Carter? Evelyn turned to see Duke Slater standing just outside the gate, his eyes filled with resentment. Behind him were three of his men, each carrying that same cocky, self-assured swagger. We just want to have a friendly little chat, that's all. Duke smirked as he took another step forward. Max sprang to his feet, fur bristling, a menacing growl rumbling in his chest. Evelyn placed a steady hand on his head, signaling him to stay calm. Duke, she said coolly, if I were you, I'd turn around and walk away. Right now. But Duke only laughed. You really think that dog of yours can protect you forever? One of his goons moved forward, raising a foot to kick Max. Bad move. Before the man could strike, Max dodged like lightning, snapping back with a fierce bark that made the thug stumble, nearly losing his balance. Evelyn grabbed her cane and slammed it against the wooden porch with a loud crack. Duke's eyes flickered with tension. He clenched his fists, but there was hesitation in his stance now. This woman, she wasn't afraid. His men started to shift uncomfortably. One of them muttered, Maybe we should go. That dog ain't normal. Duke ground his teeth, fury flashing across his face, but in the end, he jerked his head toward the street. Let's go. As he turned to leave, he spat onto the ground. I'll be back, Carter. Next time you won't be so lucky. Evelyn stood firm, watching as they disappeared into the night. She placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. Good job, kid. Max wagged his tail slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on the darkness where Duke had vanished. Evelyn knew this wasn't over, but as long as she had Max by her side, she'd never fight alone. The sound of police sirens echoed through the dark night, red and blue lights flashing, illuminating the road in front of Evelyn's porch. Ryan Mitchell stepped out of the car, his eyes swiftly scanning the scene. Evelyn stood there, as calm as ever, with Max alert by her side, watching Duke Slater. Duke sat on the ground, clutching his aching arm, his face a mix of anger and confusion. His gang members had also been detained, their former arrogance nowhere to be seen. Ryan approached Evelyn, his voice low but firm. Mrs. Carter, are you all right? Evelyn nodded, her gaze still fixed on Duke. I'm fine, but if you had arrived a little later, I might have had to use a few more moves. Ryan chuckled softly, but he knew it wasn't just a joke. Another officer stepped forward, snapping handcuffs onto Duke's wrists. He resisted slightly, but knew there was nothing more he could do. Duke Slater, you are under arrest for disorderly conduct and making criminal threats, the officer announced. Duke shot a glare at Evelyn, his eyes burning with frustration. You think you've won this time? He snarled, but the arrogance in his voice had faded. Evelyn crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. It's not about me winning. Justice wins. Residents of the neighborhood had gathered, witnessing the entire scene. Someone called out, "Mrs. Carter, you've helped this town once again." Another voice chimed in, "If it weren't for you and Max, who knows how far this would have gone?" A slow round of applause began, spreading through the crowd. Evelyn wasn't one for attention, but she knew this moment mattered to the community. Ryan patted her shoulder. "You did the right thing. Now let us take care of the rest." Evelyn reached down, gently scratching Max's head. Her loyal companion had stayed by her side through it all. "This little guy is the real hero," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. Max wagged his tail, his amber eyes shining in the night. Cedar Springs might not have been a perfect town, but thanks to people like Evelyn and Max, there would always be a light of hope. Ryan Mitchell stood before Evelyn, hands on his hips, a faint smile appearing on his otherwise serious face. He shook his head, both surprised and impressed. "Mrs. Carter, you really are a veteran who never retires." Evelyn shrugged, the corner of her lips lifting slightly. "Just an old habit, you know how it is." Ryan chuckled, but his eyes held deep respect. Evelyn Carter wasn't just a former soldier, she was a true warrior, someone who stood up for what was right, even without a uniform on her back. The townspeople had gathered, whispering among themselves, and then, one by one, they began to applaud. A middle-aged man, the owner of the local grocery store, spoke up. "Mrs. Carter, this town is lucky to have you." A woman added, "We won't let people like Duke run wild anymore. If you ever need anything, just let us know." Their words weren't just polite gestures, they were recognition. Once, Evelyn had just been an old woman walking her dog in the park. Now they saw her differently, with genuine respect. Max, as always, lay quietly beside Evelyn, occasionally lifting his head, ears perked in alertness. For him, nothing else mattered except staying by his owner's side, always protecting, always loyal. Ryan patted Evelyn's shoulder once more. "You can rest now. We'll take care of the rest." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting toward the night sky. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees in the park, carrying with it a rare sense of peace, a feeling she once thought she'd never find again after her years in the military. But here, in the small town of Cedar Springs, maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she truly belonged. The next morning, Evelyn sat on her usual bench in the park, watching as the sunlight filtered through the leaves. Max lay at her feet, his breathing steady, occasionally stirring at the sound of birds chirping in the distance. As people passed by, some nodded in greeting, while others stopped for a brief chat. No one saw her as just another old woman anymore. Now they recognized her as someone who had fought for her country and was still fighting for this small town. A young boy ran up, his eyes shining with excitement. "Mrs. Carter, you were so cool yesterday. When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." Evelyn chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Being strong isn't about knowing how to fight, kid. It's about standing up for what's right." The boy nodded eagerly before dashing off, his heart full of inspiration. Evelyn let out a deep sigh, but this time it was one of relief. Courage had no age. A true soldier never abandoned the battlefield. She might have left the military, but her heart would always belong to a warrior. And with Max by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, she would always be ready. Because that was the essence of a soldier.